Hey everybody, and welcome to another video from Electronic Armory. In this video we're going to explore iOS's WebView. We'll look at loading a website via URL, as well as implementing a back and forward button. We can send and receive JavaScript events to and from it, as well as many other things. So let's get started. So we're going to start our application off with just a basic template from Xcode. The first thing that we're going to want to do is set up our main storyboard so that we can set up our web view from there and add buttons so that we can control back and forward history of our web browser. So we have a plain old view controller here, and the first thing that we're going to want to do is go down here in the bottom right hand corner and just type in web. Now we have two different web views here. We have the Webkit view, which is what we're interested in, and then another deprecated web view that's now legacy in iOS. The old web view used to contain all the components that your web view needed. With Webkit, they've broken it up into several different classes, and you can include those classes as you need or as you don't need them, and it'll make your web view and application much more efficient. So let's go ahead and drag in our Webkit view into the center of our application here, and we're going to simply resize this so that it fits into our view. I'm going to leave a little bit of room for the top for our buttons. So down here, just going to drag in a back button. You can place these pretty much wherever you want. And I'm going to hold down the Alt key and then drag over to duplicate that same button. I'm going to resize my web view so that those match up here. And I'm going to double click on this and simply name it back. And for this one, it's going to be called forward. Now these will act as our forward and back buttons for our web view down here. Now by default, we don't want to have these enabled because we don't have any history when we initially load our web browser. So what we're going to do over in the attributes panel here is simply go down to enabled and uncheck that box so that they are disabled. And now we're ready to begin to write just a little bit of code that we need in order to load in a web page into our application. So let's switch over to the assistant view here. And we have our code here for our view controller. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do before I forget is I'm going to control click and drag over to our application to create outlets for these. And I'm going to call this one back button. The next one, control click and drag down here for forward button. And of course for our web view. Okay, let's give this a little bit of space so we have our outlets up here and then our functions down here. Okay, so once we create a little bit of space, you can see that we have a compiler error here, and it's going to complain about the web view here because we don't have the module imported yet. So let's type in import and then type in Webkit. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick build on that and just make sure that everything is running fine so that we can then try to load a URL on the web view. So right after our view did load, we're going to type in view did appear because we want to have an overridden function be called on our view controller, which is the parent class, to get called when our view comes onto the screen. So the first thing we need to do for this is just simply type in super.viewDidAppear and then pass in the animated parameter that we get from this overridden function. All right, so then as I mentioned, we're going to try to load in a web view. So if you just type in load on that web view, we can pass it a number of things. We can pass it a string of HTML, maybe that we constructed ourselves or that we loaded from a file. We can load in a file, and maybe this is a local HTML file, or we can load in some data with some other parameters. The one that we're actually interested in is going to be this request, because this is going to be a request out to the network that's going to load in the web page for us. So select the top one, and because it's asking for a URL request, we're going to have to create that object before we make this load. So I'm going to let a URL request, which is of type URL request, equal a new URL request. And for this one, it's going to ask us for a URL of type URL. So again, we're going to have to create that one first. So let URL of type URL equal URL. And then we have a bunch of constructors here. The constructor that I'm interested in is going to just be a string. And so if you scroll down a little bit, you can see that we have one that actually just accepts a string, as you're probably used to by typing into a web browser. And so the name parameter is going to be string. And the string that we're going to pass it for right now is https:// www.apple.com. So the next thing we need to worry about is because we're typing this in as a string literal, that string might be a malformed URL, in which case this will come back as null. Well, I know that this URL is correct, so I'm going to make sure that we unwrap it by hitting that exclamation point to ensure that the compiler is aware that we know that this is hopefully not going to be null. All right, so once we have that URL object, we can then pass it into the next line where it's asking for a URL. And then once we have this URL request that we're creating, then we can pass that into the next line. All right, so to reiterate, let me make this a little bit bigger. Okay, so the first line of code is just going to create a URL. That's simply just a string with a bunch of other methods and variables attached to it, which helps us construct, parse, and do other useful things with a URL. Now, once we have that URL object, we're going to create a request to go out and grab the contents of that URL and bring it back. And we're going to do that via a WebView load. And so when we pass this URL request to the browser is going to be the one that makes that URL request for us. Now, if you looked at my other video on web services, we made that URL request via Alamo Fire. Okay, let's go ahead and save everything. And let's run this really quickly and see what we have. Great. And after a few seconds, it will load up the Apple website, and we can scroll up and down. We can use the Apple top menu up here to get mobile support. And this is just like your Safari web browser. All right, so a few issues here is we need to fix out our layout because we're on a different device and we didn't set up the auto layout for this. So let's go ahead and do that first. So we go back to our main storyboard. I'm going to control-click from our web view to our view and just set up our layouts that we talked about in previous videos. So I'm setting up the leading space, the trailing space, the top space, and the bottom space to basically lock our left, right, bottom, and our top space to here. Now, this thing we want to do is make sure we do that same thing for our buttons. So our leading space, our top space, and then what we're going to do for this one is actually set a constant width. So select this little square with these two brackets on the end and do a constant width and add that one constant. And that'll be enough for that one. And then the same thing with here, but we're going to lock it to the right-hand side. So that's going to be the trailing space, the top space, and then again, we're going to give it a constant width. All right, so that's just set up our constraints to properly lay out our views on each different device that we have. The next thing we want to do is actually give the user the ability to add in their own URL or change the URL. So I'm going to add that via a text box. So if I just type in text at the bottom right-hand corner, we're going to add a text field up here, and we're going to lock it kind of close to our back and forward button. You might have a different layout for this, but and for this one, I'm going to actually set up our horizontal spacing to these and then the top space. And that'll lock it to however big the back button is. If it moves over here, our text box gets bigger, our text field gets bigger, as well as on the trailing end, and it'll always stay at the top there. Now we need an outlet to it as well. And so I'm going to drag in here. We're just going to call this URL text field. All right, once we have the outlet to that, we can then change it to the string that we have. Now, I never recommend typing in string literals here in the first place. So let's go ahead and create a string just for that. So I'm going to type in URL string. This is going to be of type string, and this is simply going to equal our string here. And that'll allow us to then use this same URL string here, as well as later, let's say down here, is we're going to set that URL text box, set the text to the URL string that we set up here. And that'll synchronize what's being loaded with what's being displayed in that text box. All right, the next thing we have an issue with is if somebody changes that text box and hits enter on it, we want to be able to load whatever URL is in that box. The way that we do that in iOS is through delegation. When you hit enter or return on that text box, the text box is going to let its delegate know that that action happened. And so the first thing that we need to do is let it the text box know who its delegate is. So if you control click from the text field to our controller here, which is our view controller there, or you can drag it over here if you want, we want to set it to its delegate. So we're telling the text field that this view controller is its delegate. And that way on our view controller on the right hand side here is we can start implementing text field delegates. All right, before we do that, we have to let the compiler know that the view controller is now a delegate for the text field. So the way that we do that is at the end of our UI view controller superclass, we're going to type in UI text field, but then delegate. So UI text field, and then you type in delegate, and now we can down here add in some auto-completed functions. So if you just type in text field down here, you'll get all of the delegate methods that we're able to get callbacks on. So we can be notified that the text field did end editing is there, did begin editing, should clear, should return, should end editing, should begin editing, did end editing. All right, so we want to make sure that we only load a web page when the user explicitly hits the return key. So when that's going to happen when we have the text field should return here. And so a couple of things. Let me make this a little bit bigger. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is this is expecting a Boolean. We do want the text field to return, so we're just going to type in true. But what we're going to do before that is we're going to get the string URL from the text field first. It's going to be a string, and this is going to come from the text field, the URL text field that is. And this might be null, so we're going to have to unwrap that before it comes out. And then we're going to want to tell the web view to load that string. So I'm just going to copy what we have up here. Just replace all of this. And that should take care of us there. Now, a silly thing I forgot to do is put a return statement there first. So return true, and that's going to take care of our Boolean there. Okay, and so again, this will take the URL from our URL text field here. It'll create a URL object from it, a URL request, and then load that request in our browser. Okay, and then one more thing is when you hit that return key, we want the keyboard to get dismissed. The easiest way to do that is on the text field itself, do resign first responder. The first responder is going to be the object that receives the first input. So in other words, a keyboard input goes to our text field. Now by saying that we are resigning our first responder, essentially means that we no longer want keyboard input on this particular text field, and thus the keyboard will get dismissed. So that's why we call resign first responder. It's not as obvious as something being called dismiss keyboard, but that's why that works. Okay, so let's go ahead and test this out really quickly and see what happens. Okay, so you can see our apple.com works up here. And if we type in something up after it, such as /Mac, go down here and hit the return key, that will call this method. So let's go ahead and actually just to prove that to you, let's go ahead and put a breakpoint here. Go back to our simulator and hit return. Okay, so that method was not called, so let's go ahead and make sure that our text field is indeed is delegating its methods to our view controller. Now I control click up to our view controller here, and it does look like it is set to our delegate. However, what I can also do to ensure that this is working is in my view did load here, set our text field delegate to ourself. Okay, let's see if this explicit programmatic set of our delegate works. Okay, so we're going to type in our URL here. And if the keyboard doesn't come up, you can hit Command K to bring that up, or go up to our hardware and keyboard, and you can toggle the software keyboard, which is this thing down here. All right, so I'm going to type in /Mac and hit the return key. All right, and so that hit our breakpoint here. Let's go ahead and switch over to our editor and just go ahead and see that that indeed worked, where we set explicitly via code our delegate. I guess for some reason wasn't working in our interface builder, but that's okay. So we're gonna run through this. We're gonna hit the continue button, switch back to our editor, and see that it is now going to the Mac store. All right, and all is great We have a few problems here is as we kind of go through and browse in our web browser, you can see that our URL at the top is not changing. So if we go over to Apple Watch, this stays static. And our back and forwards buttons don't work either. The other thing that doesn't quite work is if I go ahead and delete all of this and type in something like electronicarmory.com and hit the return key. We're going to hit that breakpoint. I'm going to remove that. Hit continue. Nothing is going to happen. We could do this all day long. And the difference is that Apple's website is protected by HTTPS or SSL, and Electronic Armory, when I typed it in as HTTP, is not. And by default, iOS will not let you load insecure URLs, even if it's in their web browser. So to fix this, we actually have to allow iOS to load arbitrary URLs. So to do that, we go back to Xcode, go back to our files, go down to our plist, and make sure it's not in any of our tests. Sometimes I edit the info plist in our tests. I'm going to close those just so we don't select the wrong info plist. And we're going to go down here, one that doesn't have a disclosure arrow. We're going to hit the plus key on here. And I'm going to type in app, and we should see app transport security settings. So I can continue typing that in and just type in app transport security settings, and you should see it. Now this is going to be a couple of different settings underneath it. So once you get that, so hit the disclosure arrow on that and then hit the plus key. Make sure that what you're entering after this is indented a little bit so that it's under here and not just another entry outside of it. And the way that you can ensure that is not only the indentation, but also the fact that we only have 3 options here. If you see all the other options that you saw when you were typing in the app transport security settings stuff, then it did not work. So make sure again that we are embedding another setting underneath it. All right, so the thing that we're interested in here is going to be allow arbitrary loads. We can also have exception domains in there, etc. if we only want our web browser to load in and secure URLs just from a couple domains in there. So allow arbitrary loads is what we want. I'm going to double click on no and just simply type in Y and then hit enter to complete the yes. And if we recompile, everything should work now. All right, so our Apple site has loaded up. Now I'm going to delete all of this up to the HTTP, and I'm going to type in : / and then simply electronicarmory.com. And once it has a few seconds to load up, you can see that this is now the Electronic Armory website, whereas before it failed, and it failed silently, not letting us know. So if that ever happens to you, again, make sure your app transport security settings are set to allow arbitrary loads to be true. So the next thing that we want to take care of is our back and forward buttons. Now, in order to allow our back and forward buttons to work and then also be enabled when we have history, we want a delegate method that's going to listen to when our web page is finished and then check to see if we can go back and forward in our history and then enable those buttons. And then when you click on those buttons, we're going to call an action on the web view to go forward or backwards depending upon which button we have. So if a user clicks on the back button, let's scroll over here, make sure this is set to automatic so that we have the correct file that we're editing. And somewhere down here, I'm going to simply control left click and drag to create not an outlet, but an action for back button tapped. You can name it whatever you want, but that's going to be my action for the back button. And then for our forward button, going to do the same thing, forward button tapped. And it is not an outlet, change it to action, and we're going to connect that. So when our back button is tapped, what I'm going to first do is I'm going to check to make sure in our web view that we can go back. And if we can, go ahead and tell the web view, go back. Okay, and we're going to do the same thing for the forward button. So just do a quick check to see web view can go forward. And if so, web view, go forward. Okay, so these functions right here are what's going to actually make the web view go forward and backwards. And if it can't, meaning it doesn't have any history to go forward or backwards to, then nothing's going to get called. Now this is assuming that the buttons themselves are enabled, which they're currently not. So what we want to do is we want to start listening to when the web browser is done loading. If we have back history or forward history that we can go to, then we again want to enable those particular buttons or disable them as needed. All right, so as I mentioned, we want to set up our class up here as a Webkit Delegate. So this is just a comma-separated list of all the protocols that we're going to implement. So for this one, you can type in WK for WebKit, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in Delegate, and this is going to give us our delegate protocols that we can implement for Webkit. And you can see that there's two. There's a UI delegate and a navigation delegate. Now we're dealing with navigation because it's forward and backwards, so we're actually going to be interested in the navigation delegate. You can check out the UI delegate version if you go ahead and type it in and then you hold down the Option key and click on it. It'll bring up some quick documentation for you, and you can go look at the full documentation by clicking on the protocol reference here, which will bring up our navigation delegate. But again, if you're interested in the other delegate methods that we have for UI delegate, then you can go ahead and do it that way as well. So once we're telling everybody that we are now implementing this interface, what we are able to do now is implement those features by just typing in WebView, and you can see that our WebView delegates for navigation anyway are listed here. You can see if any one of these are interesting to you for what you need. The one that I'm interested in is did finish. So we want to know when the load did finish, and that way we can tell each one of the buttons that, okay, once you're done loading, let's go ahead and check to see if you can go forward or backwards and then enable the buttons as appropriate. So let's go ahead and hit enter on that for Xcode to complete our code. And then what we're going to do down here, actually I'm going to switch to the editor so we have full screen here and scroll down again. So this one's going to be pretty simple. We need to tell the back button is enabled. We're going to set that equal to a Boolean, and that Boolean is going to come from the web view. And just like we saw before, can we go back? So if this is true, we want to enable, make this is enabled true, and likewise for our forward button. So is enabled is going to be whether we can go forward or not based on what comes back from the web view. The next thing we want to do is once we know that this is done loading, we can tell our text field, our URL text field, set its text to what the current URL is of the web view. So we can get the web view's URL from the web view. And now if you remember me talking about the URL as an object, not just as a string, on that URL we have the ability to get its absolute string, and that'll give us everything from HTTPS / and then the rest of the URL plus its directories and other files that it's loading. So let's just keep it simple and just use the absolute string, and it's going to add in a question mark for us immediately, and that'll set our text field URL to whatever the WebView URL is actually, but only when it's done loading. So if it takes 2 or 3 seconds to load, you won't see that URL text field get updated until after the load is done. Now that might be desirable for you, and that's usually the case. However, sometimes when you click on a link, you might want the URL to change immediately up in the URL text field as it's loading. It's really up to you how you want that behavior to function. If you do want it to happen on click, what we can do is do a WebView did commit, and that will basically means that it's going to start loading your URL. Right, but first I'm gonna go ahead and just comment that out. One thing that happens is we implemented the delegate protocol here, and we said that this class is going to implement this protocol, and then we implemented some of the functionality for those protocols, but we never told the web view that this is going to be our protocol. So let's do that right under here. So I'm going to say webview.delegate, but we have two delegates if you remember. We have the navigation delegate and we have the UI delegate. So we want to set the navigation delegate to this class. So once you have that hooked up, then you can run it and get callbacks on your delegate method way down here. Let's put a breakpoint in there just to make sure that this is working. So we're going to go ahead and run it. All right, and we hit our breakpoint on the did finish. If we switch back to iOS, you can see that nothing's loaded, but as soon as we go ahead and continue and switch back to it, then it it's indeed loading. So this actually gets called right before it gets displayed to the screen. And as we go back to iPhone here, again, we get notified that the load did finish. So let's go ahead and remove this breakpoint, continue along. And you can see that indeed we're on the iPhone page and our URL did get updated. But not only that, our back button now works. So let's go ahead and try to test that out. And indeed we go back to this. Okay, so I'll close that menu, and now we have a forward enabled. So let's go ahead and hit forward, and that goes back to iPhone. Now, if we go to, let's say, Apple Watch, now this is the third page that we've hit. And so if we go back to iPhone and close this menu, so we're on iPhone. If we hit forward, that would go back to Watch. If we hit back, that would go to the Apple homepage. All right, perfect. And that's our iOS application with an embedded web view. Now you can stick web views in almost anything. It doesn't have to be your main application, but if you want to just load up a little piece of HTML here or there, that's where you might want to use a Webkit web view. So I hope you found this video useful. If you like this video and want to see more videos in this series, make sure you subscribe to this channel, like this video, share it with friends, and head over to electronicarmory.com. We have other tutorials on all things electronics, from native mobile development, software engineering, electrical engineering, and everything else to arm yourself in the digital world. More info is in the description below. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.